Kiaria Kamau. He will be examining the institutional and infrastructural subtleties that have influenced the growth of the publishing industry in East Africa. His presentation considers questions of access, editorial autonomy, and the circulation of local narratives within regional and transnational markets. We have the famous cartoonist, Godfrey Mwampembwa, famously known as Gado. He reflects on cartooning and graphic storytelling as politically charged forms of expression, drawing on his recent work developed during his residency at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. He interrogates how graphic narratives address urgent social concerns through visual satire and embodied critique. We have a celebrated investigative journalist, Paselelo Kantai, converses about the intersection between investigative journalism and literary forms. His presentation reflects on narrative strategies, ethical tensions, and the role of the literary journal in documenting historical and political transitions. We have another very celebrated Kenyan editor, literary editor, Billy Kahora. Him and Kantai will actually be traversing that topic of the intersection of literature and journalism. So Kiaria Kamau, who will be talking about the infrastructure of publishing, he is one of our very experienced publishers. He is presently the CEO of, I would say, the biggest East local publishing industry firm in Kenya, the East African Educational Publishers. He is also the chairman of the Kenya Publishers Association. Kiaria Kamau. Seated next to Kiaria Kamau is the great investigative journalist Paselelo Kantai, who will be looking at the intersection between literature and journalism. Right next to me is the famous, the celebrated cartoonist, Gado. And next to Gado is my brother, Billy Kahora, who has been on the Kenyan, you know, what we call the reemergence, or this, what was 20 or so years ago called the avant-garde, Kenyan literature. Billy Kahora was very much at the center, very much involved with the literatures that were emerging among the young generation of Kenyan writers and literary practitioners. And it was a very big debate because our arrival was not readily accepted by institutions like the University of Nairobi. But we sustained it, and here we are, that we can have this conversation. Billy Kahora was for many years, the editor of the journal that was produced by that generation of Kenyan writers called the Kwani Literary Journal. That is a very truncated way of introducing my panel. What I'll do, I'll start by, I'll invite Kiaria Kamau. Before talking about the infrastructure, you'll touch on both of them, but a little bit of yourself and an overview of the status or the state of the publishing industry in Kenya today.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kainga. Good afternoon, everyone. As he rightly mentioned, I work for East African Educational Publishers. And let me mention that East African Educational Publishers is a company that started way back in 1965 here in Kenya, but as a British multinational called Heinemann. Later, Heinemann was acquired by local entrepreneurs and therefore rebranded itself into East African Educational Publishers in 1992. Now, Heinemann, is synonymous with the African Writers Series. So when we mention Heinemann, when we mention East African Educational Publishers, what comes to mind are books by Chinua Achebe, books by Ngugi wa Thiong'o, books by Peter Abrahams, among others. And what happened is that in 1972, our late chairman, Dr. Henry Chakava, joined Heinemann as an editor. And all through, for about 45 years, he was instrumental in driving the publishing terrain in not just Kenya, but also in Africa. Courtesy of what was known as the Triangle, manuscripts would be evaluated in London, in Ibadan, in Nigeria, as well as in Nairobi, and the final product would be published simultaneously in those three different capitals. That helped in terms of, giving a strong name to the African Writers Series. Of course, Achebe himself, his name is big because of the African Writers Series, and for that matter, because of Heinemann. Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the late, and God bless his soul, is big because of African Writers Series, and for that matter, Heinemann, and later East African Educational Publishers. So I would say that is where the journey started. But along the journey, in the 1970s and in the 1880s, other publishers, came on the scene. Other editors, with an inclination to literary works came onto the scene. And that is why the vibrancy of literature in Kenya and in Africa is still felt today. Later, we shall be talking about where are we now. Yes, have we progressed that work of AWS? Thank you.
Great. I think you can actually pass the mic to the investigative journalist, Paselelo Kansai. Yes, Pasa. Yes. A little bit about yourself and tease your topic of discussion.
We journalists don't really like talking about ourselves. But very briefly, I've been working as a journalist one way or another since the early 90s. And somewhere along the road, also ventured into fiction and literary writing. And at the moment, I edit an online platform called African Arguments, which tries to deliver off the beaten track news in terms of features, in terms of investigations, and histories. Because one of the things that I'm particularly interested in is the writing of, especially of post-colonial, post-independence histories. It's very scantily done. We don't, every time a writer or a movement gets into that space, it causes trouble, which means it's also very powerful. As we mourn Ngugi wa Thiong'o, those are some of the things we remember, as soon as you touch on history, as soon as you begin talking about the things that actually matter in in these societies of ours, you get in trouble. This has been happening for the last 60 years. And as a result, the histories themselves are quite suppressed. We get the official version of the story, but we don't get a narration, a long view, long duration narration of of the bigger story and how it has been seen from all the different perspectives from below. So yeah, we're very involved also in writing those histories of recuperating and recovering them.
Great, great. I think we'll pick it from there. I'll come to you, Billy. Yeah, your topic sort of marries into what Pasalelo does.
Thank you, Kainga. Hi, everyone. How are you guys doing? Thanks so much for coming. And I just really want to also thank Alex and the University of Nairobi. And I jumped onto this panel quite late. so thanks for this. I guess within the context of the panel, and just also in a sense what Pasalelo has said, I see my work as finding a way to tell stories from this world I am from in creative and literary form. I think in a sense that's always been my project. So I started off, I trained as a journalist, then ended up becoming very interested in like Pasalelo, creative nonfiction. And then I also moved into fiction. And then I worked as Kwani editor for 10 plus years between 2007 and 2017. At all that time, I just feel that kind of echoing what Pasa is saying about rewriting histories, for me, it was really about finding creative forms to tell the story of, in a sense, I'll say Kenya, but what I really mean is starting with the places I know best. Whether this is places like Buruburu, where I grew up, whether this is then this branching out to Nairobi and the larger environs. And in essence, I see the work I've done, whether it's writing a book called The True Story of David Munyakei, or writing a short story collection called The Cape Cod War, or editing the Kwani journals, all the people I collaborated with. The one thread that runs through all those things is many of these stories haven't been told. What's the best form for this? Is it fiction? Is it short fiction? Is it essay form? Is it creative nonfiction? And how can we tell this story? And even while I've moved away, I continue to do this, collaborate with younger writers, just to be part of this process of telling stories. And this also extends not only to written forms, but for me it's interesting sitting with this gentleman here, thinking about the different ways we've collaborated, whether it's EAPH, doing events with Goge and Mukoma when a few years ago. Pasa and I have worked for many years. He's written for Kwani. We've done projects together. Gado's cartoons we published in Kwani. We've done other projects together. So this, for me, really has been that question: how do we retell the stories of this place we call Kenya? Thank you.
Gado, I think I'll give you the microphone. You have a PowerPoint presentation, but that will come at some point. I would want you just to tease some of the things that you want to discuss.
First of all, thank you, Alex, for inviting me today. I feel very in the right company because I've worked with Pasa. He was my editor when he was at the New African. Billy, we worked together when he was at Kwani. And so I'm very honored to be here today. Pasa said that journalists don't like to talk about themselves, but editorial cartoonists don't want to talk about themselves at all. So you will forgive. I will try. I've worked with I've been an editorial cartoonist with the Daily Nation from 1992 to 2014, and then I took a break, and then I jumped to the Standard newspapers, where I worked until January 2024, when I got a fellowship at STIAS, Stellenbosch Institute of Advanced Study, where because I'm working on a graphic novel project on radicalization and counter-Islamic terrorism. So it's a project that I've been working for a while. I've researched for some time, and I took some time off from daily editorial work simply because it's very difficult to do the two. So I'm still working on it. Hopefully I'll have my manuscript ready by the end of the year. It's a much more difficult project than I thought. I think, but one of the things I would like to say is that I was extremely lucky when I started working at the Nation, because I think I joined the Nation at the right time in 1992 when things were starting to change, and so I'm fully aware of the advantage that I had, or rather I'm fully aware of the history of that, because it really, as a young editorial cartoonist, it's very much starting with a very, you can, not a clean slate, but it was a time when the wind of change was blowing, and so I was lucky in the sense that, and I worked at this very powerful newspaper where I had very protective editors, and over the years I have been, one of the things that I insist is that behind the scenes I was also very much protected, despite some of my horrible drawings that appeared in the newspapers, and there were legal cases and things like that. And so it is within that background that I also honed my skills and also ended up working with different publications. The reason why probably I chose to do the graphic novel is when I started working on it, was almost, I have rather commented on the subject of radicalization as an editorial cartoonist, but what I did find was that you find that there were gaps that were there in terms of the reports and the books that were written, and it was very interesting to me, and I felt that probably a long form of my work in a long form would probably also tell a story. Just the same way like the editorial work that I do, with editorial work, it's a medium in which you say the things that probably other mediums would not touch. You go to places that, other mediums would probably massage but as an editorial cartoonist, you can't draw, President Moi dead and still trying to prevent free speech. And so I felt that, I think I can also do almost similar with the subject of radicalization and counter-violence extremism, and it looks at that along the East African coast. And so that is also what I've been doing for the last 3-4 years.
Great. Now, so those are the introductory remarks from my panel. Billy, I'll come to you. You know, in my introduction, I did say that when Kwani came, it came sort of as an avant-garde group of young writers. And in fact, the name Kwani itself has a history. And when you arrived, institutions like the University of Nairobi, Dr. Alex Wanjala there and his colleagues, they actually dismissed the arrival of Kwani. And there was one professor who actually called that generation, this generation of young writers, as literary gangsters. And one of the very prominent faces of that group of writers, Tony Mochama, who is a journalist with the Standard newspapers, I was very much present when he was launching his first collection of poetry. And he called that poetry book, What If I'm a Literary Gangster? So a little bit of that friction between the older generation or institutions of learning, like the University of Nairobi and others, and you, and how you are able to sustain that.
You know, I can't come to someone's house. Huh? I can't come to someone's house and insult them. Kainga's putting me in a very interesting position. So interestingly, actually, when I got here, by here I mean I was studying in South Africa, so I kind of returned around 2004, late 2004. Then I'm back and forth, and then I'm back here in 2005. And Kwani was already running. Kwani already had produced 2 journals. And while I was in South Africa is when I started writing, and I sent some fiction to Binyavanga, and he liked the story. So when I got here, he was like, let's meet up. And I knew Binyavanga, even though I hadn't seen him for years, because we were in a Nana school together. But he was ahead of me. So he was not a stranger, even by the time he was reaching out, right? So I missed, which is a way of kind of, I missed the heat of these things. And Pasa might be able to say more because he was there. But I'd been a student at the University of Nairobi. So in a sense, this place wasn't strange to me. But I left to go study in South Africa. So in a sense, when I come back and Binyavanga asks me what I think of the 2 Kwani journals, I tell him it's great, but I think you should think about this thing called creative nonfiction. And this is a form I'd encountered in my university because a guy called Johnny Steinberg, who's a great, great South African creative nonfiction writer, came to teach at my university. So I was kind of blown by this thing. And at the same time, I was getting tired of, at the time there was still a pretension of something called objective journalism, the 5 Ws and a H and whatnot. So this for me helped me kind of bridge the aspects of journalism that I liked and respected, and the thing that I desired to do, which was creative writing. And that's what creative nonfiction as a form does. So I tell Binyavanga, you should seriously think about creative nonfiction. And in true inimitable style, Binyavanga was like, why don't you do it? And actually, just like that, that's how I started working with him. And I was lucky enough for the Munyake story to fall in our laps because Binyavanga was talking to a person who became a really good friend of mine and ours called Jidu Kibinge, who was doing this documentary on this guy. So that was the opportunity to test this form, but also a way of trying to get writers to write this thing. And I became a co-editor. So I started working with Kwani 3. But in terms of these other debates about literary gangsters and so forth, there was a series of exchanges in the papers, in the press, in the nation. And I think Binyavanga wrote a piece, I can't remember where. And then one of the professors at the University of Nairobi wrote back. Was it? No, it wasn't Kabaji. Kabaji's thing came much later. There was someone else. But anyway, so Binyavanga's impatience was really what he felt. He felt that literature was being treated, I think here, a bit maybe more formally. I can't remember his exact words, but these are things that are relatively, I think, easy to find. But essentially, there was a kind of to and fro for 2 years. But I think as time went on, look, you've got to remember that Kwani collaborated with the University of Nairobi almost throughout its thing. When we brought Chimamanda here, we brought her to the university. When we brought Nuruddin Farah, we approached the university and said, this is the biggest place and stage, right? So even while these kind of literary debates were going on in the papers, which I think is healthy, to be honest, there was a lot of collaboration happening, right? And I think a few individuals, one of the professors in English at the time, was quite irked by Binyavanga's thing, and he responded. And I think this went on for quite a while. Even Egara wrote much later, Kainga, as you say, and this was much later in the 10s, in the 2010s. A critique, let me call it a critique. So, in a sense, I think it was driven very much by kind of the original salvo, but eventually, and I think formal spaces like universities and kind of outside of these spaces, I think that's a healthy tension. Because why should we agree? Actually, why? As long as the thing is constructive, right? Let it go on. Let Tony Moshama write whatever he wants to write. Let the university guys say formally what they think literature should be. This is as old as literature. This has been hammering for a very, very long time. These beefs are continuous. But what I again want to emphasize is that even in spite of those things, there were things that were consistently kind of going on. Does that make sense, Kainga? Yeah, okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Pasalelo, I'll come to you because I want you to tie your contribution to what Billy has just said about Kwani. Because at Kwani, you also piloted a form of writing or a project that you called a new journalism.
Well, it's actually the same thing, and we did it together with Billy.
Yes.
I came at it in a very different way, or in a different way. My own journey was, having started. I think my first ever piece was written when I was. Well, it was published in The Nation, and I was still in high school as an op-ed. And in those days, my father, who had been teaching here and then was booted out in the early 70s, and then was not being allowed to write anywhere. So people saw my piece as my father smuggling in, channeling through me. So that's where I started, and I remember all kinds of fellows around, writing in and saying, why are we defending these radical dissidents, this kind of thing? And I was like, wow, if you think of me as a radical dissident, that's quite something. Anyway, I went into journalism properly, worked in mostly the magazine scene around here, because I always liked to write, and I thought that the magazine scene gave you a little bit of space to actually do some decent work rather than just kind of spontaneous outpouring. All the same, journalism and literature in the 90s in Kenya were basically, what do you say? Chalk and cheese. There was just no point at which they met. I mean, the discussions in the newspaper, the endless discussions in the newspaper were on literature were about Kenya being a literary desert. This old Taban Loliong quote from circa 1972. You know, this is what drove the debates in the paper. There were debates about and of absence. So when Kwani shows up, when Binyavanga comes back to Kenya, we start talking, we kind of form a kind of literary soiree thing. It feels very much at that point, you know, 2002, Moi is leaving, Kanu is going. It felt very much like the end of something, perhaps the beginning of something else. And the idea of actually stretching and expanding horizons was very much at the kind of heart of the Kwani zeitgeist. One of the arguments that we started to have with Binyavanga was about fiction. And, you know, I came, you know, now a little bit hard-bitten as a journalist. I came from a point of view that, look, we need to get our stories out. There is no need for artifice. There's no need to, you know, do fiction, because our stories are so unbelievable. As always, you know, fact is far more unbelievable than fiction. And our stories are so much, you know, we're teeming with stories all over. So let's get these stories out. How do we get the stories out? Binyavanga, on the other hand, was like, no, well, we're going to, you know, fiction is the best way to smuggle these stories out. Anyway, that was kind of the basis on which we moved into new journalism, creative nonfiction, that space. How to begin telling some of these stories. We did not have the tools. We had to borrow them, we had to import them, et cetera, to begin setting up this kind of project. One of the things that I involved Bill in it, was I started thinking of a way of doing immersion journalism. And by immersion journalism, I mean a journalism that just refuses to reference the center, which I felt that journalism in this country had been a very useful ally for the political elite. And basically they turned Kenya into a moving theater. The story of Kenya had got very little to do with Kenyans, but everything to do with the political theater that arrived in towns and villages outside Nairobi every weekend or every Wednesday or wherever. And it was all about reporting the politicians and their activities in those places. But those places were mutually strange to people living outside them. And the things that happened there had actually been rendered in many ways on a very kind of almost racist colonial script, which made the places strange. You know, the things that happened, the things that are reported in the newspaper, the things that are carried, well, you know, it was the old story of, you know, if a dog bites a man, it's not news. If a man bites a dog, then there's a story there. So what is being carried in the papers, for the most part, is reinforcing the idea of the strangeness of these places, which of course runs very consistently with the whole rubric of development. You know, in order for you to be developed, you know, you have to be coming from a place that is, you know, it's a process of evolution. Yes. So we are watching the evolution. You know, we are narrating the evolution of these places and reproducing these hierarchies. Mm-hmm. And we're reproducing these hierarchies here. And the whole point of immersion journalism was like, actually, no, you know, perhaps it's better to almost kind of anthropologize these places and say that we're going in there, we're going to talk to about these places on their own terms. You know, what are the kind of construction myths and narratives. What does this place believe of itself? How does it operate? And tell those kinds of stories there. Because, you know, at that time, I should add, I might be going on for a bit long, but I should add that, you know, we were very much a centralized republic where Nairobi was the center of everything, and, you know, everywhere else needed permission almost to basically exist. Yeah, so that was how we got into new journalism, creative nonfiction, journalism. All that.
Great. Yeah. Now, there's a name that has actually been mentioned repeatedly by Billy Kahora and Pasalelo Kansai, Binyavanga. His full name was Binyavanga Wainaina. He was actually the glue that brought these young Kenyans together. He won the Kane Prize for African Writing, I think in 2002. And yes, 2002. And part of that little money, he used it as the seed to start organizing this young group of Kenyan writers. Now, Kiarie Kamau, the publisher from East African Educational Publishers, you spoke about the African Writers series, which was very famous for producing and putting African literature on the global map, because that is the project that published Peter Abrahams, Chinua Achebe, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Taban Lo Leong, all of them. And Chinua Achebe was actually the founding editor of that project. He was there from 1962 up to 1972. And when he left, that is when Henry Chakava was sort of his successor, but then it was now split into those three different points that you are talking about. You published a book on Henry Chakava, the chairman of East African Educational Publishers, and in that book you have a very beautiful piece of writing where you try to show the evolution and even the tensions within the publishing industry and even at the East African Educational Publishers at that time. Because when the African Writer series started, there was suddenly this interest in trying to understand the African culture or any literature that sprang from the continent that had something, some elements of cultural, that was very attractive. And when Henry Chakava took over, he realized that these urban centers were growing very fast, and there were stories within these urban centers, and there were literatures that were emerging. You could talk of Charles Mangwa and Meja Mwangi and all those writers. And it was not easy for him to actually persuade his colleagues in London to start publishing this kind of literature. So I want you to touch on that evolution, moving from what the African Writers series, what Chinua Achebe was expected to do, and the kind of literature that he published, and the evolution that you started having these narratives about the city and what was happening within the city and around the city.
Thank you. I think I'll call it new voices and new forms. Gado has just mentioned that he's doing a graphic novel, and I want to encourage him to think about East African Educational Publishers as his first publisher, because we believe in experimentation. You'll be happy to note that we actually published Frank Odoi's Akokan, the comic. It is that experimentation that gave birth to new voices and new forms. One area is, around the same time, the academia, there were discussions about literary forms and the segmentation of, serious literature. When you talk about Ngugi, Achebe, Cyprian Ekwensi, Elechi Amadi, and others. Then there was popular literature, and at some point, it was even, there were forms referred to as pulp. But it is through experimentation that Henry Chakava and other like-minded editors interrogated and asked themselves, What do Kenyans want to read? What do East Africans want to read? In terms of preferences, tastes, and so on and so forth. And you allow me here to talk about the process of identifying what should be published. That when I joined East African Education Publishers in early 2000, we had very vibrant and very intense editorial and production board meetings, almost along the lines of what happens at universities, where you defend, your term paper, your dissertation, and so on and so forth. So we would receive tens of unsolicited manuscripts. Editors would go through them. There would be preliminary assessment where you would reject based on preliminary assessment or accept for the next level. And then reports would be generated, external reports through readers. Those reports would be presented, 2 or 3, sometimes more, based on the complexity of the work. And the work of the editor was to defend. You defend. Why should this be published in terms of who you read this book? The warehouse people would ask questions. Is this the kind of book that you just sit in the warehouse and it is not moving? The marketing people would wonder, where shall we market this book? And of course, finance people are always putting a spanner in the works, and they would wonder whether it will bring a return on investment. Finally, a decision would be made. It is through those intense, interrogative, editorial and production board meetings that this process of experimentation took form. And that is where it was realized that there is space for Meja Mwangi's works. There is space for John Kiriamiti's My Life in Crime. There is space for Charles Mangwa's Son of Woman, and so on and so forth. It is the same interrogation that informed the decision to publish the Gikuyu books by, Ngugi. It was just experimentation, and Henry Chakava has mentioned in his book, Publishing in Africa, One Man's Perspective, that when he published the full-length novel, Saitani Mudharavaine, later translated into, Devil on the Cross, he was surprised. He had just done the initial copies, 10,000 copies, thinking that, let's see how it will perform. They were literally flying off the shelves, and he had to keep on reprinting. Even to date, we are doing those books. So again, the experimentation realized there is space for books written in indigenous African languages. It's the same experimentation that, courtesy of Chinua Achebe, I think there was a conference in Zimbabwe in the either 70s or 80s, where he dismissed most of the storybooks that our children were reading as beautifully packaged poison. Why? They did not resonate with our social, cultural setting. And he encouraged Africans to write their own stories, because there were those oral stories that, children used to be told. They said, can they be published? Can we have our own voices? And indeed, they were published. To date, if you visit any bookshop in Kenya, I think 65% of what is there is children's literature. Very, very many storybooks in English, in Kiswahili, cutting across the board. Same experimentation that gave birth to translations. The current, what was there in 70s and 80s was translations of the leading works into Kiswahili. But today, there are so many voices, so many writers doing short stories in Kiswahili, full-length novels, drama, and so on and so forth. So I would say that the journey that was started in the 60s by those iconic literary luminaries has continued, and it is becoming even much more vibrant. New forms. But there is still much more experimentation. When Kwani started, we were there and we were watching and seeing, what are these guys up to? And we said, well, it's another way of experimentation. And indeed, you would open that Kwani journal and see a poem that starts there, moves to the left, moves to the right, and so on and so forth. And you say, if this is what that particular generation that is being targeted wants to read, go ahead, publish. Let's see how it you sit. I want to conclude by again urging my friend Gado here. We are waiting for that graphic novel. Thank you.
Great. Don't return the microphone. I still want you to hold on to the microphone, KK. It's called Kiare Kamau, so we shortened the name to KK. Now, KK, you introduced a term there, popular literature, new voices, and then sort of, new voices and then popular literature. So what is the distinction between popular literature or these new forms of literature that Dr. Henry Chakava was beginning to experiment in early 1970s, as opposed to the literature that was published by Chinua Achebe when he was the founding editor of Writers Series?
Yeah, maybe to get a good distinction, if you read Ngugi's Petals of Blood, or Achebe's Arrow of God, or let's say Lechi Amadi's The Concubine, and then you read Meja Mwangi's Going Down River Road, and John Kiriamite's My Life in Crime, or Charles Bangwa's Son of Woman, you will see a clear distinction. That what literary scholars and critics of the time were saying, here are works that are a bit intense. You know, you read and you want to sit back, reflect on those 5 pages you have read, try to internalize, try to interpret, try to ask yourself, what exactly is this author saying? How can I relate this to what is happening in this country, in East Africa, in Africa, and beyond? 2, when you read Kiriamite's My Life in Crime, is a thrilling work of art, adventure, romance, fast-moving, enjoyable. You can read even when you are, on a bus, and you don't have to go back. Maybe you can go back and remind yourself, this character, is this the same who has done this and that? So they said, why don't we have all these, we have enough space for all these forms of literature. Where in a class of literature, I'm sure the tutorial classes are still there, where you'd go for your lecture, then there are those small groups, tutorials, and you're interrogating work. And sometimes you interrogate and you realize that you have just talked about only one chapter because the work is so intense. As opposed to where you say, well, this was very thrilling, I just read it in one sitting, it's about this and that, it has helped to plug a certain gap so that we are feeding us forms of taste. Currently, I can tell you, in the publishing terrain, we have realized, and all these also, apart from the editorial boards that I talked about, they emerge from market research. Editors, marketers are sent out there to do market research in bookshops, among learners, among general public, teachers, and so on and so forth, to know what exactly do people want. And there is a gap that was identified about 15 years ago of young adult literature. And that is emerging. Again, you go to bookshops and you see the section on young adult literature is quite generous now, in both English and Kiswahili.
Great. Our technician, I think you should be now beginning to prepare the slides for Gado. He's going to give a PowerPoint presentation. Yeah, but before that, KK, the last question, very briefly. Kenya today is also known for this upsurge, this explosion of self-publishing. How would you account for that self-publishing? Is it that the traditional publishers like EAP are so suffocating that people just feel that they are not going to be published by the traditional publishers, so they have to do it their own way? And maybe just as a subtext to that question, there's that criticism leveled against the Kenyan publishers that you concentrate too much on the textbook, that you do not have enough budget for creative works.
Yes, let me start with yet another category which I would call, the bold category of literary works. And in that bold category, I would put Wahome Mutahi's 3 Days on the Cruise. It's not the kind of work, they talked about the days of Moi's repression. It's not the kind of work that would have been published easily, because it was both, non-fiction as well as elements of fiction, and it shed light on what was happening. There was also autobiographical works like Wanyere Kihoro's, Never Say Die. Yeah? Again, works that shed light on what was happening at the Nyayo House, torture chambers. Now, to mainstream publishers vis-a-vis self-publishing. When we talk about self-publishing, I say there are perhaps 2 forms of self-publishing. There are those people who take time to give their raw manuscripts to different people, not necessarily their friends or brothers and sisters, but people who you give them those things which people don't like to hear. Serious reports. And then once they get those reports, they address the issues that have been raised in the reports, and they produce another draft and give back to the same people to see whether the reports they had given have been addressed. The final outcome is usually a solid work of art, and it can go far and wide. I don't have to mention names, but I have a number of names. Some of them are actually lecturers here at the University of Nairobi who have taken that pain of getting their manuscripts evaluated by peers. But there is also another form that, they bring manuscripts, or they take their manuscripts to the mainstream publishers. The publisher gives out that work for reports, assessment reports. And the reports, recommend fundamental changes in the work, or dismissing certain areas and so on and so forth. And that particular author thinks that this publisher is not interested in my work, is actually discouraging me. To address all these things, it will take so long, yet my brother told me this should be published as soon as yesterday, and therefore they proceed and do proofreading of the work using the computer, ChatGPT now, and so on and so forth, and produce the work. Unfortunately, that work does not go anywhere. They still come back to us and ask, can you help us to distribute this work? But we cannot distribute a work that we do not want to be identified with. So to get published is a very intense process. It can take long. And the issue of publishers concentrating too much on textbooks, it goes back to, a publishing firm is first and foremost a commercial entity. And a commercial entity, you report to shareholders, and you have directors who take care of those shareholders. Every year, you have to file a report to show what have you brought any return on investment. You will not tell the shareholders that in the year under review, I published 200 works of fiction, and we expect those 200 works of fiction to start bringing a return on investment in the next 5 years. You'll be kicked out immediately. But what they expect is you balance, and that is where Chakava used to talk about a publishing house lying between the cathedral and the stock market exchange. You balance that you do 5 works of fiction, solid fiction, and 50 different textbooks or revision books.
Okay.
So that when you weigh, you are going to report that we brought a return on investment, and we also have these particular works that we know for sure, if well marketed, they will bring a return on investment in the next 2 to 3 years. So it's a very delicate balancing act.
Great, KK. You've actually tried to acquit your colleagues and yourself, but I'll still come to crucify you. Gado, I would want you to actually take the microphone and give your PowerPoint presentation.
I must admit, I think there is some confusion. I think my PowerPoint was not necessarily to do a presentation about it. I think I spoke to it, and I must apologize because I came late. I think it was to be used as a backdrop because it's long, and I certainly don't want to bore people with my horrible drawings. But it was basically also so also not to take away, because I think they've also seen a lot of them, so probably take away from the joy of the audience, and you know, so that take through them those drawings. But just I would like also to add that and by the way, thank you KK for the offer. Thank you for adding that pressure on me. I'll definitely consider that. But I will also want to add that, I mean, the graphic novel as a genre, in Kenya has also been growing for some time now. We have had quite a number of comics. There is always a fine line, serious people would like to refer to that as, graphic novels. I mean, give it a little bit of respectability. But you have, let's say, comics that have been published for some time. My good friend Frank Odoi did publish a graphic novel, comic, Akokan, which was, very wonderful work. In fact, I've been talking to, I still want to see if actually we can animate it, by the way. And so that is also, there has been actually quite a good evolution in terms of actually the graphic novels as a genre. And I think, the late Terry Haas, was at the forefront of that, starting with the Joe magazine back then in the 70s, but he has done a number of graphic novels. He has illustrated Nairobi as a city that was done. And so there has been actually quite a number of those books. And also, most importantly, there is also a trend across the globe whereby you are seeing a lot of literary work being done in graphic novels. That's quite happening a lot now. I actually did, while in South Africa, I bought a book, rather, To Kill a Mockingbird by Lee Harper. There's a graphic novel to that came recently, a few years ago. And it's wonderful, illustrated by, I can't remember the name. You have, there is, in South Africa, we have a number of graphic novels that have been published. There is one called, I forget the name, but it is basically, it illustrates the labor movement in South Africa and the history of the labor movement in South Africa. So this is actually a genre that is growing. I think even I've seen it, I remember buying this. There's the book by Sapien, by Noah Harari. There is actually a graphic novel version, which is very popular. So it's a genre that is very much growing. It's a genre that actually, it has been there, but I think also because of the Gen Zs and the new generations that are much visual, you find that lots of literary work is being translated or into graphic novels and graphic comics. I thought that probably I should also mention that. Yeah.
You spoke about, in your opening remarks, you spoke about that there are certain things that a cartoonist can do that a writer would be afraid that you'd tread where angels fear to tread, or something like that. And so what does that mean? Does it mean that as a cartoonist, because as an artist, you can write as an artist and be very critical about certain things in society, but the escape for an artist, for a writer, maybe you would use those stylistic devices, whether it is metaphor or similes or symbolism, and you are making this very strong critical point. Does it mean that in cartoon there's no subtlety? You are just direct. You don't, when you draw your cartoon, you just say things, so there's a way in which you also work with the mind of a poet who would actually be very critical of government, but is using metaphors and stuff.
I think also, you know, probably, let me put it this way, it's much easier probably to use cartoons, you know, cartoonists that consider that boy who points out that the emperor is naked when everybody is saying, the emperor's clothes are wonderful. And so I think it is much easier in a sense, but also it is, you can say probably a modern day court jester, in a way. To give an example, is that, but to add to that, is that also the wonderful thing about editorial cartoons is that they, I keep saying, I use this phrase that I have editorial, editorial control and editorial rights, of editorial copyright to my work, but I don't have any actually rights to their interpretations. And a lot of times, actually, one of the wonderful things over the years is that people just come up with their own stuff about. And it's difficult because the audience they consume, I think that is one thing that they can draw loads of their own interpretation. And so my interpretations, yes, I have a copyright to my interpretations, but certainly I don't have copyright to, I have copyright to my drawings, but certainly I don't have copyright to their interpretations. I remember I did a drawing, this was, I have not included it here, but I did a drawing in 2005 of a Muslim lady strapped with a suicide belt, and the commentary, the suicide bomber who's female was asking a sheikh, like, okay, what am I going to get after this, mission, Am I also going to get the 72 virgins? Now, the idea was simple, is that, well, we know very well that male suicide bombers, there's a claim that they will get 72 virgins. Now, we don't know, what female suicide bombers will get. And it was a very, but then at that time, I must add, there were all these female suicide bombers in Middle East, in Lebanon, and there's one who blew herself in front of the, at a wedding. And I thought I was actually, I was asking a fair question. And it was strangely interpreted. I think the soup came here, organized demonstrations from Jamia Mosque to Nation to complain about it. The board, I think for the first time there was I even got a memo from the chairman, and it was very intense. And that mind you, that was before the Muhammad cartoons in Denmark. And I was threatened. My family was threatened. I was, it was pulled out of, internet, and I received. So it was actually quite interesting and I even, some of my Muslim friends, we had very interesting discussions that, what did you mean, and so forth. So I think, but apart from that, the debate was very, I think it was fairly healthy in terms of what is it that, because again, as I thought I was being actually a feminist here. I was saying, okay, women are, they have to get something. Yeah, because, we know that men, they're going to get something. So, I think that is one essence of, editorial cartoons. And I mean, there are so many examples. That is not one of them. But that was 2016. So there are examples about that actually, they can, and actually you go back even in the United States, that you have actually satirists and editorial cartoonists that are being hounded out today from their newspapers. So we mustn't forget where we are today and the role of editorial artists.
Great round of applause for my panel. Yeah, we'll come back to them, but I would want to invite questions from the audience. Where is the roving microphone? Where is the roving microphone? There are many questions I can see. Yeah, there are quite a number. Where are the roving microphones? This one is not working. Oh, it's working. Okay.
Let me say quickly, thank you for the presentations, and I can attest to the fact that political cartoonists in the United States are fired. The one in the city that I teach in Pittsburgh, was fired precisely for being perceived as too leftist. We were all shocked, since that's supposed to be a space of free speech. I have a question, though, about the African Writer series in relation to the East African
Educational publishers.
Educational publishers, and the division of the series on the one hand, and the accessibility, availability of that great and wonderful list. So you spoke to what you want to acquire, and that's terrific. You also spoke to the question of publishing is first and foremost a commercial entity, and that's correct as it should be, because otherwise how else would you continue? But I wonder if, as someone who teaches this stuff, I wonder what's available to students. The AWS is no longer available in hard copy to students in the US, and I suspect not in Europe, and you can only get it if your library has tens of thousands of dollars to buy the online version. So my question is about the literary history of the continent, because that backlist contained lots of stuff in English, but some things translated from the French, some things translated from various, from Igbo and various local languages. And honestly, I have no idea of how one would get Arma, for example, or any of the writers on that list. Some, Things Fall Apart's never going to go out of print. That's fine, that's great, wonderful, but there are many, many others that writers and texts that are not so easily available. It's a huge question, I know. It's about multinational capitalism and Reed Elsevier and things of that sort. But I don't know if if there are nuts and bolts responses or ways to think about it that you all have.
Great. Just before you give the microphone, I would want you, Kenya, just before you give the microphone, just give the microphone back to her first. No, just return it to her first.
To me.
No, return, yeah, and then she'll give it to you. Kenya Broadcasting Corporation is actually recording this session, and it will be broadcast on the premier literature program called the Books Cafe.
Okay.
So when you take the microphone, you introduce yourself. You say your name, and if you are from a university, you mention your university.
Okay.
Great, yes.
I have no problem with that. Susan Andrade and University of Pittsburgh.
Thank you. Next.
Thank you.
You start by introducing yourself, and then you ask the question. If you can direct it to any particular member of the panel, or if it is a question for any one of them to pick.
Thank you. My name is Arjuman. I teach in the EAFL University in India, Shillong campus. I have actually two queries. One regarding the publication industry here. Like we have a famous site called LibGen, and there's a lot of pirated copies available there, which is making the life of the students quite easier. And we also have a lot of shops where there's photocopying of textbooks and reference books. So a few years back, there's one case against some of the photocopy shops in Delhi due to copyright violations. But the shop owners association, they won the case saying that what they were doing ethically was correct because they are helping the students to get some cheaper books, or I mean, it was easier for the students to get the books which are not available. So personally, I have noticed that some of the books that I have purchased here from the Indian standard, I find them still expensive here. So how the students are coping here, and what kind of challenges the publishing industry is facing here from sites like LibGen and all that. So there is one question. Second thing is related to, to Gado. In all your cartoons towards the right-hand corner from my side, this is very small, flowery kind of symbol with question and asterisk, apostrophe marks. And it is like almost in every cartoon that you have. Does it have a special significance? Thank you.
Great. There are more questions behind. Start with this one.
Cool.
Just on your.
Hi, my name is Rex Tan. I'm from Malaysia. I'm a freelance journalist associated with Free Malaysia Today. So I think just sound like from the discussion here, it sounds like Kenya has a rather vibrant and vibrant journalist scene, especially the political satire cartoon are quite provocative. It's quite if the local publisher is willing to publish it, I think it says a bit about press freedom. But I find it a little bit strange that how come it is on the World Press Freedom Index, you guys are ranked quite low, 100 and plus. So, perhaps I would be interesting to hear, but I'm not saying that I think that that is a golden measure, because I also have some question about them regarding Malaysia's ranking and all that, but they couldn't give me a satisfactory answer. It's a rather Western way of looking into different countries' way of operating. But I'm also curious, like, since we're talking about literature and journalism, do you guys maybe think that because of perhaps the political suppression, if there's any, that somehow encourage journalists try to find a voice in literature? That's my question.
It's a fantastic question. What are the tools that are used to gauge where there's, because we have our problems, but Kenya is much, much better than many of our neighbors. So take two more, and then you give the microphone, and then we go back to the audience. Yeah, Pastor, that's your question.
My name is Gloria Ajami Makoha. I am a lecturer of literature, Kenyatta University, and currently a postdoctoral fellow with African Literary Metadata, Uppsala University, Sweden. I have two questions for KK and one for Gado. So KK, the reading culture in Kenya has gone down significantly. Do you find this a problem? I'd like to know what you think about the future of EAEP. And do you also have options to your hard copies, or you just produce hard copies? Do you have audiobooks and all these others? Because from my observation, the libraries are quite empty nowadays. They're not as full as they used to be. So what does EAEP do about this? Are these things you consider when you publish? And then a while ago, JKF scaled down from publishing to offering scholarships, I think, or something like that. Should I look at that as a threat to the publishing firms? I'd like to hear your opinion on that. And then to Gado, I'm so happy to finally see you, because I mean, I was born looking at your cartoons in newspapers and feeling happy about them. So just a cheeky question for you. How did you arrive at the name Gado? Thank you.
Great. That's the last one, and then we will allow them to respond to the questions.
I am Mumia Osaji from the University of Nairobi. I have a question to Billy, KK, and Barcelelo. I have noticed that you have an interest in what you are calling creative nonfiction. And I noticed that there are two genres in creative nonfiction that appear to have some kind of preference in your endeavors. And that is life writings, including biographies, autobiographies, and memoirs, as well as literary journalism. But there is another form or genre of creative nonfiction which is not getting prominence in your publishing industry and your activities, and that is the personal essay. I'm just wondering, from where you sit as practitioners, experts, could there be a reason why the personal essay is not emerging as a prominent genre for writers in Kenya and the region? Thank you.
Yeah, KK, you go first. Thank you. First, I'm very excited to hear that there is a good market for African writer series books out there. It's already exciting. But sadly, I do agree with you that they are not readily available. It is historical. You know, AWS was started by Heinemann, which was a multinational. And for the Kenyan outfit, that is East African Educational Publishers, we had restricted rights. First for Eastern Africa, then for the larger part of Eastern Africa, and then the other rights would be given to another publisher. Heinemann has since been bought by different companies, changing names, and often those new buyers are, one, sometimes not interested in the African writer series, two, are clueless about the historical journey of African writer series, and three, literally pushing most of those books to out of print. So what we have been doing as East African Education Publishers is to identify the works that have been pushed out of print, and we redo them. It's a difficult journey because of copyright-related issues, and we have at times carried a disclaimer that we have published this book for educational purposes. We have not been able to identify the current rights holder, and we'll be happy to discuss rights once that rights holder comes on board. With regard to availability, I can confirm that we do have some of them, not all of them, on Amazon. And we also do have most of them on African Books Collective. African Books Collective is an outfit based in the UK, and they do sell in digital format as well as in print on demand, POD. Print on demand might be a bit expensive than the normal print, but not as expensive as some of the books I see posted on Amazon. And lastly, I want to say, your question is also in a way a wake-up call. I think we need to interrogate the whole list and be bold enough to offer that whole list as long as it is not available through another publisher who was given rights for a certain region, so that we are able to feed the whole world. Thank you. Now, the other one is on piracy. Indeed, piracy is a serious menace here in Kenya. You'll be surprised that sometimes the books are even pirated before the publisher has released their first copies. You know, if it is a popular author and we start pre-publication, publicity, somehow using crooked means, sometimes maybe even internally, the designers can sneak out a copy. Then, even before you have released your book, you find it on the streets or in some bookshops run by crooked, entrepreneurs. We work very closely with the Kenya Copyright Board and the Anti-Counterfeit Agency. It is a very difficult thing. Here in Kenya, sometimes if a book is selected by the Ministry of Education to be set text, it can sell in hundreds of thousands. Sometimes, 1 million, 1.5 million. So these pirates have moved to the next level. We have adopted so many ways of trying to kill piracy. Holograms, check tags where you scratch and a number you send and so on and so forth. But, the buyer is not interested in those things because the buyer is interested in a cheap book. So the buyer will not go the whole hog of scratching, sending the SMS, being told it is, is quite difficult. So what are they doing? They are even printing these books offshore, in India, in China, in Dubai, coming in containers. So again, we try to work with the port officials through the Kenya Copyright Board, so that any container that comes and it is carrying books, the Kenya Copyright Board must be informed. The Kenya Publishers Association must be involved. But I can tell you, it's a menace. It's a very difficult thing to fight, but we are not relenting in the fight. There is the issue of open access. It's a whole group of people who say books should just be made free, open, available, so that we can build a knowledge economy. But what they fail to understand is that, what about that author who has invested their creativity in coming up with a book? What about that publisher who invested to publish that book? Again, that's a group that we are fighting as a Kenya Publishers Association, as a WIPO, the World International Property Organization, because if they are given their say, then it means we shall be killing creativity, and the return on investment, especially towards the author, will not be realized. Why are books expensive still here in Kenya? About 4 reasons. One, we still suffer VAT on books at 16%. So when we are doing the costing, we must load 16% on that particular book. We have lobbied the government for the last 10 plus years. We have used parliamentarians, we have used international organizations. Again, just like piracy, we will not relent. We want that VAT on books to be removed. Secondly, all the paper that is used to print books here in Kenya is imported. So that also adds to the expense in terms of the price of the book, the final price of the book. Then we want to mention that there are no incentives that we get from the government. We would want to think that in order to have a vibrant knowledge economy, it is important to make books easily accessible. And to make them easily accessible, one of the ways is to make them affordable. So, and to make them affordable, the government needs to step in, give incentives. Hence, when we do all the costing, we are able to reduce the prices of books. Again, that is work in progress. Reading culture gone down. I'm not very sure, because we have not done a scientific research to gauge that level. But maybe if we look at the copies that we sell, general books, once we release a work of fiction, it's not necessarily on the reading list in schools or colleges or universities. We look at selling between 3,000 and 6,000 per year. We've realized that with the good marketing, we are moving even to 10,000 copies. Secondly, there is a marked proliferation of book clubs by young people, middle-aged people, and even old people, reading all sorts of books. We find that to be very exciting, and we think that the reading culture is improving. And then third is there are so many organizations that are coming in to help fund the libraries in schools and also community libraries. Some of them, alumni of institutions, they say, what we want to give back to our community is a library. I want to say that from where we sit as publishers, the reading culture is improving by the day. It could be better, but it is improving. That's why there are so many works of fiction targeting children, young adults, different forms, popular literature, serious literature, and so on, so every time. And even what Hainga was talking about, self-published authors coming up. Audiobooks, digital books, we ventured there. This is a very dicey area. I don't like to say that it is hype, but let me mention that even though we have invested in audiobooks and digital books, the sales are extremely low. There are certain books, Osagi has mentioned about biographies and autobiographies. All the biographies that we release, when we release them here in print form, we simultaneously release them in digital form. They are available on Amazon and ABC, and even on other local platforms. But when you interrogate the sales after 1 year, it's very disappointing. You'll be surprised to get that you've only sold 2 copies. 2 copies. 1, 2. Yeah? But the other, when the other is pushing for availability of the book, you say, I'm a prominent figure, which is true, a prominent figure here in Kenya, in East Africa, maybe to the level of an ambassador. I have links in France, Australia, US, and so on. All of them are asking for this book. So we release, and we also release the links. But the sales, I have not seen any book that has sold more than 20 copies in 1 year as a digital book. So it is very difficult. And also research in the West has shown that still the uptake of digital books is dismal. It's still dismal. People are still so much into the print book. That does not mean that we will not continue investing in digital as well as audiobooks. Jomo Kenyatta Foundation moving away from publishing and going into offering scholarships. It was a government decision. And I don't want to go into the politics of what informed that, but it was a sad thing because Jomo Kenyatta Foundation had published quite a number of authors, especially those early authors. David Mairo has been complaining. Yeah? He had about 20 different books by Jomo Kenyatta Foundation, still working to get rights back, republish, give them to another publisher. But, well, we are here, and more publishers are there to publish what Jomo Kenyatta Foundation is not able to publish, is offering scholarships. Personal essays, yet we are doing so many biographies and autobiographies. I can say maybe that is an emerging area that we need to do market research on and see whether it is an area that we might want to invest in. The exciting thing is that now we do have in Kenya these print-on-demand machines. The print-on-demand machines are the ones that if you want 1 copy, it will produce 1 copy. If you want, the market says 5 copies, it will produce 5 copies. As opposed to the traditional printing machines that if you print less than 500 copies, then it will not make business sense. So it's an experimentation that we can do. I know there is a journalist called Waithaka Waihenya. He used to do very wonderful essays in the dailies. I know at some point he published, but Osaji, if you have essays, bring them. Let's interrogate them.
Great.
Yes, yes.
Great. I was actually, a round of applause for KK. Yeah, he's actually, he learned from the best. He was actually, when he joined the publishing industry, he still had some of the best. Now he's one of very treasured luminaries as a publisher. And yes, I was going to mention my former managing director, Waithaka Waihenya. He actually published his collection of essays. I think it's called Dancing in the Twilight. Those were his personal essays. There's also a gentleman who used to be a columnist for the Standard and then the Star, Cap Kirop. He also published his personal essays. It's a mixture of pieces that were published in newspaper and then some that are very original. And I can also tell you that I'm done with my manuscript of travelogues and personal essays. Great. Pasa and Billy, you will actually respond to the question from a friend from Taiwan, Malaysia, a friend from Malaysia. Great. And then after that we'll take more questions, a few questions, and then we shall conclude the session. So it was, Pasa, you still remember the question? Yeah, okay.
Hello? Hello? Okay, thanks. Just a very quick one. I think somebody talked about archives, and I think that question was directed at AWS and Heinemann, but I just wanted to mention that this is also a problem with more recent literary works. But what's also interesting is that people like Bookbank, who held the Nairobi Hay Festival, are trying to digitize a lot of the work that has come out in the last 20 years. So that's part of their project, kind of just reviving. Even just, for example, Kwani journals. Like, you can't, I mean, after Kwani ended in around 2018, people can't access that work. Personal essay, there's a lot of personal essay now on the internet. This new generation of writers, at least writers writing from the last 10 years, have been working on that form a lot. It's hard to find. I think it's easier kind of thinking about which writers have been writing for the last 5 years, but I find that generation/age group are very, very interested in, I think, the personal essay form. I feel that I think at Kwani, when I was Kwani editor, a lot of writers, let's not forget the context of Kwani coming from the 90s and a particular urgency for kind of rewriting. People felt an urgency of rewriting people's worlds. So the thing about Pasa saying about this kind of creation of strange worlds. So I think there was quite an emphasis on the idea of rewriting, I think, those spaces. And just to acknowledge that Paselelo had written this incredible work called A Deal in the Mara, which was written way before even Kwani was thinking formally about creative nonfiction. And I think at that time, we weren't thinking so much about the personal essay as opposed to more recent literary groups like Jalada and Kare, like in Jalada, I think those writers are very interested in the personal essay form, and a lot of those writers are now publishing like online, all that. Yeah, yeah.
I think I'll start with
Pastor, I would want us actually to be brutally brief in our responses.
Yeah, I think I'll start with the question of media freedom. Look, if you look at the kind of media terrain, in the Kenyan media terrain of the last 20 years, you know, it's kind of waxed and waned. There have been attacks, you know, direct attacks by the state or you know, people associated with the state. I remember 20 years ago now, the First Lady storming into a TV studio and slapping around the journalists there because she was completely fed up with their coverage of her husband and herself, and of course that became coverage on its own. More recently, last week, just to kind of finish that transact of these arbitrary attacks on the mainstream media generally, during the protests on June 25th, the executive director general of the Communications Authority issues a circular instructing TV stations to stop reporting live. It is patently unconstitutional, completely wrong-headed, and you know, this was supposed to be in the interest, the usual kind of state story of in the interests of order, peace, and security, and so on. And what you see, actually, what was very interesting about the response this time around was a number of media, you know, associations as well as media houses themselves, just told him no. They said, look, you're misquoting the Constitution. You are threatening us, and you know, we're not going to take it. But he switched them off anyway. He actually sent people to the transmission sites, the physical transmission site, and switched them off. And is this the beginning of like another era, another age of dark days of Kenyan media? It might well be, but I simply think that the problem right now for the state and its agents and its supporters is they simply don't have the tools to regulate a media landscape that includes the digital world and social media. Simply because being themselves as narcissistic as you know, the next person, they're not going to switch themselves off. So this remains to be the big struggle around how to regulate social media. Is there a need to regulate social media? Is there, how do you design libel, slander laws in the 21st century that are also going to incorporate some of the things that happen in social media? There's a need for debate there, definitely. Yeah, but back to the assessment of the state of media freedom. I don't know where, and I don't know how, the likes of Freedom House and the others kind of do their rankings. I've always thought that you know, the kind of baseline reference was the Imperium itself. You know, that Freedom House would say that we are obviously demonstrably the most free, and everybody else begins falling down that line. I mean, that's just my cynical view of it. I don't know how they do it. It's hard, leave it.
Great. A round of applause for Billy and Pastor there. I'll give a chance to Gado to say something just before we conclude.
I think to just quickly add to what Pasa said, I mean, on that question is that it's interesting that as I, you know, there are some drawings that I showed. I think there was one of the president as an emperor without clothes. I dare say that probably that cartoon will not be published in the mainstream media today. I'm not sure, but I tend to think that, you know, the mainstream media has come under so much attack that, you know, we have clawed back from the gains that we've had in the, you know, from the 90s. So that is also something to ponder, really. And again, to the question of ranking, I think that's questionable also, because I was recently, by the way, discontinued. I had a contract with DW as a contributor, Deutsche Welle, in their, you know, in their Swahili service platform online, and my drawings were seen, I suppose, anti-Semitic, and I got, you know, a reply from my editor who's a friend who said, Gado, you know, I would like you to tread on, very careful about this Israeli-Gaza thing. And so I told him, no, I think our deal is you publish what I give you. If you don't feel like publishing, it's fine, but you don't dictate what I do. I think that you say, no, I know, I'm on your side here. It's just that things are so hot around here in Germany, and so I'm just giving you a heads up. And so, you know, true to his word, I mean, you know, I think the bosses there decided that I'm a troublemaker, and they discontinued the work with them. And I have seen that actually with The Guardian. They sacked Steve Bell, somebody who has worked for The Guardian for over 40 years, the cartoonist, and who, by the who did a drawing, you know, rather attacking Netanyahu. It was seen anti-Semitic. Again, to read, you know, the Washington Post sacked Ann Ternez, you know, one of the very few brave female cartoonists in the U.S. So I don't know the ranking that, I mean, we need to interrogate the rankings now, again, now that we have these, you know, lots of actually conflicts that have opened our eyes. To the question that my sister asks about, I think these at the corner of my drawings, that there was always a character that I draw. It started with the idea that when I started in the early 90s, I think editors were very careful with what I draw, and, you know, and so I found out that, you know, if I actually write a sinister comment or something, you know, they look at it and they think it's 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock, they want it done. They won't look there, you know, down there, and so they will go through, and the next day, you know, people will find out. So it started that way, but of course it was also popularized by you know, one of my favorite and great American cartoonist, Pat Oliphant, who drew a penguin at the corner of his cartoons, but also loads of other, you know, previously other cartoonists have used that trick, whereby you would have something, but also you would use it for different forms. You can add salt into wounds, you can say something, you can add a profanity in there, you can add whatever. I mean, I think, you know, rarely you would find people would question that. But there was an editor who later told me, he said, you know, I know what you're up to. When I look at your cartoons, I don't look at it. I always look around. There are always things you leave, you know. So that's one wonderful thing about editorial cartooning. And last, about my name being Gado, I think when I started working here, you know, I'm Tanzanian, by the way, so I've been given all manners of tribes in Kenya. So Kenyans have claimed me, and I have accepted that. Tanzanians have fought them to remind them that, no, he's one of ours. Even though now I'm a little bit, you know, I'm not sure if I can go, at least now, you know. But so when I started here, the editors told me, no, we can't use your name. You have to find a pen name, because I started I was studying architecture in Dar es Salaam, and when I came, I won a competition, and so I came to collect my prize money, and they convinced me, or rather I convinced them, you know, I can do 1 month, because I think they had lost my good friend who was a cartoonist, Paul Kelemba Mad, had left for the Standard, and they spent 6 months, they couldn't get anybody. They did a competition, I became second. So when I came here to collect the prize money, they said, no, you can't use your name. They can come after you, so you must find a name. And so I chose Gados, one of those names you give yourself when you're a young man and hot-headed. It was a kind of football name I gave myself when I was a teen. So that's how it got stuck.
Great, what wonderful ideas that are coming through. Professor Iribe Mwangi has actually just told me that we have another session, last session, that the team that is seated in this hall would be wanting to actually be part of that, and they would want to start preparing to go to that. But Prof, I would indulge you. There's a gentleman who is just seated next to you, Professor Lynn Bartford. I would want him to actually ask the question that is burning.
Okay.
Prof, begin by introducing yourself.
Yes, I'm Brent Lindfors. I've been retired for the last 22 years, but I used to teach at the University of Texas at Austin. This panel has been wonderful. It's been very interesting and very informative. But I'd like to know, and I'll direct this question to Billy, whether there are any writers in East Africa who can survive on literary writing alone. Ngugi had a wonderful career, was very successful, but he had to take a professorship in California to lead a comfortable life. David Mailu has written more books than any other Kenyan, but I don't know if that's sufficient for surviving. Is it only journalists who can make a living on the kind of writing they do?
Great, so that's a direct question. Bill, I would really want you to be brief in your response to Professor Lindford.
You'll forgive me, Kainga, but somebody else just said something very quickly that I think is very important about what are writers now going to do, what are writers now doing about the situation now, right? And it's interesting for me that with all the things that are going on, I know a young group of writers who want to write about what's been happening with the protests. Because writers tend to come quite late into the game. It's only after the collection of material. And they come to me and other people to ask, how do we do this? I think that's quite, I just realized that question was still left wondering. The short answer, I think, for literary fiction is no. In fact, probably the most successful novel writer of literary fiction is Yvonne Owuor. And she's a full-time writer, and I've written about this, but I think especially with the novel, people are either funded by the Miles Morlands, etc., or you've got to have a very supporting family where you're actually staying at home. So I've talked about the novel as a kind of new form of privilege, literary privilege, if you're able to successfully write it and you're living on the continent. But that said, there are writers who are doing commercial, popular works that might not find recognition within spaces like this, or even spaces like us who are literary minded. Like there's a woman called Joanne Thatia who writes these kind of racy, kind of popular books, Confessions of a Nairobi Housewife, etc., etc. She's collecting checks, so I hear, big checks, and laughing all the way to the bank, right? I've also heard that the so-called self-published novelists, writers who are kind of emerging and being sold by Nuria Bookshop, are actually being given relatively like big checks. I don't know how true that is. That I still have to kind of confirm. And they're producing some kind of street literature. That would be generally my response to that. and I hope it's useful. Yeah.
Thank you. Dr. Alex Wanjala, you have some interventions to make.
Yeah, thank you very much. Dr. Alex Wanjala, University of Nairobi. I'd just like to say thank you very much to the members of the panel. Pasalelo and I went to the same high school. Yeah, years ago. I used to consistently beat him in English, you know. But he was better than I was in French. I must say he was the best student in French. And, you know, surprisingly, I went on to double in French, and he went on to work in English. And now we are on different sides of literary production. He's the artist, and I'm the critic. I think that speaks to the question Hainga was raising earlier, and he was saying that, you know, the university labeled, you know, literary practitioners with, you know, unsavory monikers, if I may call them that. But I don't think there's need to fight. There's enough space for everybody. Producers produce, critics critic, right? If producers are not producing, then there's no work for critics. So we all need each other. And it goes back to the age-old battle with people who used to call critics brushes of noble men's clothes and all that. So as Billy said, this is a time, I mean, it's an age-old battle which is neither here nor there. Because when all is said and done, you know, all these people are family. Billy is family, Gadu is family, Hainga is family, Kamau Kiari is family, you know. We planned this panel over a beer and Nyamachoma about a year ago with Pasalelo and Gado. I just met them and asked them, what are you doing? And we started talking. And we said, why don't we come together? And here we are today, you know. It's just that maybe the university does not have so many such opportunities, you know. If we could have all these people coming together to Kenya so every often, then we definitely invite you over. I think Kamau Kiari, we've interacted a couple of times this year, and you promised to call me for something. So I'm still waiting. Yeah, so there's this link between the industry and the university that should be enhanced. And I'm glad we are here today together. And I do hope that this is something we will carry on together in the future. So there's no need to draw daggers and stab each other in the back, you know. We are not fighting, we are good friends.
Great.
Thank you very
much.
Great,
a round of applause. We shall do those claps for each one of my panel. A round of applause for Billy Kahora. A round of applause for Gadu. And a round of applause for Pasa. We call him Pasa. Big brother. And a round of applause for KK, Kiaria Kamau. Dr. Anjala, you are a teacher, but let me tell you something. He's called Kiaria Kamau. No, not Kamau Kiaria. Great, wonderful. Thank you so much for those ones who are able to come for this panel. This conversation will continue. There are more events. This conference is actually happening up to Saturday. So we can carry these conversations even from here. A round of applause for Hainga. See you at Alliance, those ones who are going to Alliance, and then we'll see you tomorrow again. Take care. Bye-bye.